By August 14th of 1945, Nazi Germany and the Japanese Empire surrendered. World War II came to an end. The Korean people, who had suffered the brutal occupation of the Japanese Empire, were finally liberated. However, the celebration was short-lived. The entire Korean peninsula was soon occupied by foreign powers yet again. The US claimed Korea south of the 30th parallel, while the Soviet Union occupied Korea north of the 30th parallel. This marked the beginning of a new chapter of Korean history. For some, revolution and self-determination, and the others, the beginning of the fight against the most powerful empire in the world. The Koreans in Northern Korea celebrated liberation and welcomed 33-year-old Kim Il-sung as a new leader of liberated Korea. Kim Il-sung was a well-known figure who earned his fame through his guerrilla campaigns against Japanese troops in Manchuria. However, even before Kim Il-sung's return to the fatherland on October of 1945, the Korean people took action to reclaim control over their country. After Japan retreated from Korea, one might expect chaos and confusion. However, the opposite happened. Within days of liberation, localized and autonomous organizations called People's Committees formed in all provinces, cities, and villages across Korea. Declassified US intelligence documents reveal that Americans knew just how organized and effective the People's Committees were. The People's Committees elected leaders, distributed food and property, collected necessary taxes, and established infrastructure and order. This was not only in the north, but in the south as well. 80% of all Koreans by liberation were peasants. Naturally, they were mostly left-leaning, and the People's Committees reflected this. For example, the People's Committees of South Gyeongsang Province, which is in current-day South Korea, established the following platform. Most People's Committees across the entire Korean peninsula shared similar or identical platforms. Under the leadership of Kim Il-sung, People's Committees across Northern Korea unified to create one political system. People's Committees were eventually adopted into the central government and are still the local governing bodies in North Korea today. It is important to note here that Northern Korea did not become a sort of colony of the Soviet Union. Even according to American sources, Koreans were governing themselves. And in 1946, the new Northern Korean government introduced groundbreaking laws that Koreans had never seen before. Under the slogan of "Land to the tillers," peasants were granted ownership of the very land they worked. Most wealthy landowners maintained their wealth by collaborating with the Japanese occupation and were viewed as national traders. However, the landowners were given a choice: join the farmers as equals or flee to the south. One landowner recollected his experience during the reform. The new communist government took away our land overnight and gave it to the tenant farmers. They called it Land Reform Number 1, saying the land should belong to the people. For the first time in my life, we had to do some work. That is the first time I ever put my foot right into the rice beds. Workers also reaped the benefits. Under the new labor law, North Korean workers received benefits that South Korean workers are still fighting for today. And for the first time in Korean history, a gender equality law was established. Mr. An Hak-sup, born on April of 1930, lived and witnessed liberation and the aftermath. Although he was born and raised south of the 30th parallel, he joined the Korean People's Army during the Korean War. He received education and training in Pyongyang and fought as a guerrilla fighter in the South. For his actions, he served 42 years and 4 months in South Korean prison, making him one of the longest imprisoned political prisoners in the world.
자본주의적인 그 개인 이익을 위한 그런 게 이제 인민의 것을 만든 거죠. 전부 국유 이제 공공재라든가 토지 이런 거 모두 국유화해가지고 인민의 것으로 한 거예요. 전부 임대중의 거 아니면 집단 단체 앞으로 다 해놓은 거죠. 그들 거로. 그래서 거기는 이건 내 땅이라는 개념이 없어요. 우리 거, 우리 땅. 그러지 이건 내 땅이 아니에요. 그런데 봐요. 자본주의 사회는 힘 있고 돈 있고 권력 있는 놈들이 다 차지하고 있잖아요. 그럼 노동자들은 그 사람들은 이제 일해주고 거기서 주는 거 흘려주는 거 얻어먹고 있어. 거의 자본주의 계급사회하고 사회주의하고 차이가 나는 거예요.
From end to end of the Pacific, the work of liberation continues. The city of Seoul, capital of Korea, is occupied by American forces.
Initially, Koreans south of the 30th parallel welcomed the United States. However, Koreans quickly realized that the US troops came to occupy, not liberate. General of the US Army Douglas MacArthur very clearly announced his intentions to the Korean people as the US began its occupation of southern Korea. To the people of Korea, by virtue of the authority vested in me as Commander-in-Chief, United States Army Forces Pacific, I hereby establish military control over Korea south of 38th degrees north latitude and the inhabitants thereof, and announce the following conditions of the occupation. All persons will obey promptly all my orders and orders issued under my authority. Acts of resistance to the occupying forces or any acts which may disturb public peace and safety will be punished severely. For all purposes during the military control, English will be the official language.
해방될 때는 숨어있다 해방됐으니까 그 감격이랄까 기쁨이라는 것은 아마 당하지 못한 사람은 그 실감을 느끼지 못할 거예요. 참 기뻤어요. 참 누구보다도 열렬히 미군이 해방시켜준 줄 알고 알았는데 가만히 보니까 그게 아니더라고. 점점 어긋나는 거예요. 메가더가 이제 그 미주리 함대에서 보고령 발표하는 걸 보면서 내가 잘못 들었나? 해방에 자기는 정령군이라고 그랬어요. 그리고 남조선에 군정을 실시한다고 그러고 바로 해방이라는데 어디서 해방이 됐다는 거예요? 해방이 어떻게 됐다는 거예요? 일본 제국주의 식민지 하에서 미국으로 다만 이양됐을 뿐이야. 주인이 옮겨졌을 뿐이지 달라진 거 하나도 없지 않냐. 그걸 보면서 반미 운동을 시작한 거예요.
US objectives in southern Korea were clear from the beginning, creating a colony where American interests will be fulfilled. However, there was a problem. The vast majority of Koreans did not want another occupation, and the few that cooperated with the US occupation were wealthy landowners who thrived under the previous Japanese occupation. Americans were fully aware that most Koreans were left-leaning and hated the Koreans who collaborated with the Japanese. Southern Korea can best be described as a powder keg, ready to explode at the application of a spark. The most encouraging single factor in the political situation is the presence, in Seoul, of several hundred conservatives among the older and better educated Koreans. Although many of them have served with the Japanese, that stigma ought eventually to disappear. To address this problem, the US occupation created the Korean National Police, or the KNP. However, the recruits of the KNP weren't ordinary Koreans. They were former members of the Japanese colonial police force. Under US direction, 80% of the colonial force was reinstated. The KNP is a refugee home for Japanese-trained police and traders, including corrupt police who were chased out of North Korea by the communists. The police department is rotten and is an enemy of the people. 80% of the Koreans will turn communist if this condition persists. Detective Choi was terminated from the KNP after he delivered this report. The biggest threat to US objectives in southern Korea were the Korean people themselves and the people's committees, as the interests of the colonizer and the interests of the colonized are inevitably the opposite. Koreans fought back. On September of 1946, 8,000 railroad workers in Busan went on strike. Due to labor policies enforced by the American occupation, the workers and their families were starving. The workers demanded increase in rice rations, higher wages, housing and rice for jobless workers, better working conditions, freedom to organize, and a labor reform law like the one that passed in Northern Korea. US troops and the KNP suppressed the protests, and on October the 1st, a demonstrator was killed. This ignited a series of violent rebellions that spread across southern Korea like wildfire. This rebellion is known as the Autumn Uprising. What began in Busan quickly spread to the rest of South Gyeongsang Province, then North Gyeongsang Province, and in less than a month, Gwangju, where 34 years later, South Korean troops under US command would kill over 2,000 protesters. The riots pushed south through Chungcheong Province, Gangwon Province, and even to Seoul and the nearby cities. In areas where the uprising took control, rice was confiscated and shared among the people. Koreans, even children, led by their local people's committees, were marching for a Korea free from US imperialism. A peasant from a town in South Gyeongsang Province wrote to his fellow peasants, "To the peasants, let us build an independent country with our own hands, transfer all power to the people, distribute the land among the people equally, let us oppose the collection of all grains." Protesters in Jinju demanded to North Koreanize South Korea. Seongju People's Committee members told the Americans, "We do not want our country to be a colony of the US." The US responded by mobilizing US troops and the KNP and opened fire on the protesters, killing many. The US occupation recorded the following deaths in the following provinces: South Gyeongsang Province, 202 killed; North Gyeongsang Province, 72 killed; and in South Jeolla Province, 82 killed. These are only the recorded and known deaths. We can only imagine how many more Koreans really died at the hands of US troops and US-trained police. Ultimately, the uprising failed in expelling the US occupation. The uprising was a spontaneous and sporadic movement with no real central leadership. However, the Autumn Uprising was not the final armed resistance from Koreans who wanted an independent Korea free from US imperialism. 2 years later, US troops and US-led South Korean police would commit massacres in Jeju Island, where tens of thousands of civilians were butchered. By 1948, the US was preparing to officially create a separate South Korean regime by holding UN elections. The US was fully aware that this was against the wishes of the Koreans in the South. The People's Committee of Jeju Island led an armed rebellion to fight this decision. They did not want a separate southern regime that would sever Korea in half. US troops and South Korean troops under US command invaded the island. The death toll is estimated to be between 30,000 to 100,000. And when the people of Yeosu refused to partake in the massacre in Jeju, again, up to 2,000 were killed. And on August 15, 1948, the Republic of Korea was founded, which formalized South Korea as a US colony with ultra-right Syngman Rhee as the very first president. Then, on September 9, the North responded by founding the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Contrary to popular belief, the fighting between northern and southern Korean troops did not start with a surprise attack by North Korea on June 25th of 1950. Fighting actually began almost a year prior, with southern forces under US control instigating most of the battles. Australian journalist Wilfred Burchett, who was present in Korea before and during the war, recalled, "According to my own, still incomplete investigation, the war started, in fact, in August-September 1949 and not in June 1950. Repeated attacks were made along the key sections of the 38th parallel throughout the summer of 1949 by Rhee's forces, aiming at securing jump-off positions for a full-scale invasion of the North." What happened later was that the North Korean forces simply decided that things had gone far enough and that the next assault by Rhee's forces would be repulsed. That having exhausted all possibilities of peaceful unification, those forces would be chased back and the South liberated. The Korean War was a civil war, instigated by American occupation and division of Korea and its people. While most of the northern forces fought as the Korean People's Army, some, like Mr. Anak-sub, fought in special guerrilla units behind enemy lines.
내가 감옥에 가게 되면서 이제 6.25 전쟁 내가 나가지고 교미 전쟁이 일어나고 나서 소위 유엔군 미군이 상륙할 때 북으로 갔습니다. 북으로 갔다가 북에서 공부하다가 52년도에 중앙 지시를 받고 여기 인민군 정복을 하고 나왔습니다. 완전 부정하고 대원들 데리고 대원들 사람들 나오다가 대원들은 다 죽고 생포됐어요. 또 이제 그냥 진영만 사는 게 아니라 전향하라고 조선민주주의인민공화국을 부정하고 대한민국도 아닌 대한민국을 충성한다고 그걸 하라고 하는데 그건 참 못하겠더라고. 사람에게는 두 가지 생명이 있다고 하는데 생물학적 생명, 즉 인간의 생명 그대로 말하는 거고, 하나는 정치적 생명, 이제 사회적 생명이라고도 하는데 동물에게는 사회적 생명이 없습니다. 정치라는 게 없으니까. 근데 사람이 더 정치적 생명이 없으면 그건 사회적으로 매장된 동물이거나 하나의 물건에 지나잖아. 전향 안 한다고 해가지고 고문을 많이 당했습니다. 그래서 고문 당하다 죽은 동 전향하라고 고문해도 고문에 죽은 동지들도 있고, 그 고문을 이기지 못해 자결한 목매에 죽은 동지도 있고, 고문대 직접 피토하고 죽은 동지도 있고, 워낙 심하게 고문을 하니까 자결을 했어요. 나도 자결을 계획을 안 해봤다면 거짓말이고, 진영 무기 살면서 도망 생각 안 해보고 자결, 그 고통스러운 속에서 자결을 생각 안 해봤다면 그 거짓말이에요. 한번 자결할 준비까지 다 해놓았는데 한 동지가 먼저 자결을 했어. 그런데 지들 이렇게 들으니까 지들끼리 복도에서 지들끼리 얘기하는데 손 안 대고 코 풀었다고. 그 얘기를 들으니까 너희들 좋으라고 내가 자결해? 내가 어떻게 살아왔는데. 거기에 반발심이라고 할까? 오기가 생기더라고. 그래서 자결을 취소했어요.
People like Mr. Anak-sub fought the US during the Korean War to fight against colonialism. So how is South Korea now, in the 21st century, a colony of the United States? On the outside, South Korea appears to be an independent country. You don't see Americans holding government positions or American troops patrolling South Korean streets. However, in the 21st century, colonialism can fully operate much more quietly, while projecting an image of sovereignty. From Syngman Rhee of 1948 to Chun Doo-hwan in 1988, South Korea was ruled by a series of military dictatorships. During these 40 years, countless Koreans were killed in the name of anti-communism. These dictatorships would not have been possible without the permission and support of the United States, because to the United States, it did not matter who was in charge, as long as South Korea remained a US colony. To learn more about how South Korea remains a US colony to this day, I spoke with Mr. Won Jin-wook from the Pan-Korean Alliance for Reunification.
반갑습니다. 저는 범민련 남측본부 사무처장 일을 하고 있는 원진욱이라고 합니다. 1945년 남과 북이 분단된 이후 처음으로 만들어진 거족적인 통일운동 단체이고 빼앗긴 자주권을 되찾기 위한 민족 자주 실현, 그리고 흩어진 우리 민족의 힘을 모으기 위한 민족 대단결 운동을 그 사명으로 가지고 있는 통일운동 단체입니다. 민련은 특징을 좀 말씀을 드리면 1990년 결성이 되는 그날부터 지금 33년이 지난 2023년 오늘까지 소위 국가보안법이라고 하는 그런 악법을 통해서 여전히 지금도 탄압받고 있습니다.
The role that the national security law plays in enforcing US colonialism in South Korea cannot be understated. The national security law was enacted almost immediately after the founding of the Republic of Korea in 1948. This draconian law was inspired by the Japanese Peace Preservation Law, which was used to suppress Koreans who fought for independence from the Japanese occupation. Since then, the national security law has been weaponized to suppress education, politics, and labor movements that threatened the status quo. The national security law states that any person who praises, incites, or propagates the activities of an anti-government organization is subject to punishment. The definition of the crime is loose, and it is so by design. To the South Korean government, the primary anti-government organization is North Korea. This has allowed the South Korean state, for decades, to frame individuals and organizations as North Korean spies or sympathizers. Countless student protesters during the military dictatorship era were killed and tortured under the accusation of them being North Korean spies. Today, despite claiming to be a democracy, the South Korean government frames pro-reunification and labor rights activists as North Korean spies and imprisons them. The national security law goes beyond punishing activists. It restricts South Koreans from having any kind of exposure to North Korea outside of government propaganda. If you write the wrong poem, you can be imprisoned. In 2023, a South Korean man was sentenced to 14 months in prison for writing a poem about the free healthcare, housing, and education in North Korea. And if you listen to the wrong music, you can be imprisoned. In 2010, a woman was sentenced to 2 years in prison for storing North Korean music on a USB storage device.
국가보안법이라고 하면 다소 생소할 수 있을 것 같습니다. 그리고 세계 여러 나라들, 특히 이제 제국주의로부터 식민지 지배를 받고 있는 나라들에서는 이와 유사한 법들이 존재할 수 있는데요. 일단 이곳 이남 사회에 존재하고 있는 국가보안법은 잠시 그 역사를 좀 살펴볼 필요가 있습니다. 과거 1910년부터 1945년까지 약 36년간 우리 조선은 일제로부터 식민지 지배를 받아야만 했습니다. 당시 그 일제는 우리 조선을 식민 지배하기 위해서 치안유지법이라는 걸 만들게 됩니다. 치안유지법은 다른 말로 하면 식민지 통치법이라고 할 수 있는데요. 그 뒤 이 치안유지법을 보고 따라한 법이 바로 미군정 시절 이승만 정권 때 1948년 단독 정부가 수립되고 난 직후 이 국가보안법이 만들어지게 되는데, 일제강점기 시절 일제가 우리 조선민족을 탄압하고 독립운동을 가로막기 위해서 만든 치안유지법 조문을 거의 그대로 베꼈습니다. 그래서 그 탄생에서부터 그리고 본질에서도 국가보안법은 다른 말로 하면 미제의 이 이남사회에 대한 식민지 지배를 가능하게끔 그리고 합법화하기 위한 하나의 그 근거가 바로 국가보안법이라고 할 수 있습니다. 그래서 질문하셨듯이 국가보안법은 누구를 보호하기 위한 법입니까? 라고 물어본다면 그거는 이 땅에 주둔하고 있는 미군을 보호하기 위한 법이고, 그리고 미군의 보호하에 식민지 대리정권을 자청하고 있는 이곳 이남 정부와 정권 그리고 기득권들을 보호하기 위한 법이 바로 국가보안법이고, 그러면 그 법을 통해서 누가 피해를 입고 있냐라고 질문하셨는데요. 그건 바로 방금 말씀드린 것처럼 이 땅의 민주화를 위해서, 그리고 통일을 위해서, 그리고 민족의 자주권을 찾기 위한 투쟁, 운동을 벌이는 사람들이 국가보안법의 1차 피해자가 될 수밖에 없습니다. 그래서 당장 저부터도 범민련 활동을 하면서 주한미군 철수, 평화협정 체결, 한미동맹, 아주 세계적으로도 대표적인 예속 동맹인 한미동맹을 폐기하라고 주장하는 그 순간 저는 바로 국가보안법을 위반하게 되는 것이 됩니다. 국가보안법은 불과 법조항이 몇 문항 안 되는, 몇 장 안 되는 아주 짧은 특별법임에도 불구하고 헌법 위에 군림하고 있습니다. 헌법 그 이상의 지배력을 가지고 있고, 그래서 헌법이 중요하다라는 건 모두 알고 있는 사실이지만 헌법 위의 법이 바로 국가보안법입니다.
The US occupation of South Korea is maintained by US troops. Currently, there are over 28,000 US troops in South Korea, and most of these troops are stationed in Camp Humphreys, which is the largest overseas US military base in the world. To learn more about the ongoing struggle for expelling US troops from Korea, I spoke with Ms. Kim Eun-hye, the student chairman of the People's Democracy Party.
안녕하세요. 네, 저는 민중민주당 학생위원장 김은혜입니다. 민중민주당은 지금 여기 보시다시피 미대사관 앞에서 매일 24시간 1인 시위를 하면서 미군 철거와 평화 통일을 위해서 투쟁하는 당입니다. 이름 그대로 민중민주당, 민중을 위하고 민중에 의거하는 당이라고 해서 민중민주당이고요. 미군이 이제 철수해야 되는 이유는 미군은 사실 이 땅에서, 이 한반도 땅에서 전쟁의 화근이라고, 핵전쟁의 화근이라는 생각이 들어요. 그러한 이유는 사실 지금도 전쟁 연습이 진행 중에 있거든요. 그래서 북치맥 전쟁 연습이 지금도 진행되고 있고, UFS 훈련이 지금 시기에도 진행되고 있을 뿐만 아니라 최근에는 이제 일본의 자위대까지 독도 한반도 인근에 계속해서 끌어들이면서 전쟁 연습을 실시하고 있어요. 그래서 이른바 한미일 삼각 군사 동맹이라는 이유로 사실상 이곳에서 전쟁을 일으키고 있는 주범은 미군이고, 같은 민족인 북을 적으로 하는 북수뇌부 제거 연습이라든지 그런 훈련 등을 진행하고 있는 그런 전쟁의 화근은 미군이기 때문에 미군이 철거돼야지만 가장 우리나라에 평화가 올 수 있다고 생각을 합니다. 사실 원래 보통은 외교에서 전쟁이 일어났을 때, 그러니까 국권 통수자라고 하죠. 그런 사람이 사실 보통은 대통령에 있기 마련인데, 사실 우리는 전시 작전권이나 평시 작전권, 특히 전시 작전권 같은 경우에는 미군이 가지고 있는 현실이에요. 사실상 대통령이라고 해도 전쟁이 일어났을 때 유사시에 대해서 판단을 하는 것은 사실상 미군인 거죠. 국가 주권이라고 했을 때, 혹은 군대 통솔권자라고 했을 때 그 권한은 철저히 지금 미군에게 있는 상황인 거예요. 그래서 전쟁을 지금 끊임없이 일으키고 있는 상황이 사실 미군에 의해서 이루어지고 있는데, 전쟁을 일어나냐 마냐 판단하는 것 역시 미군에 의해서 정해지는 현실이에요. 사실 이것만 봐도 우리나라가 얼마나 이른바 한미일 삼각 군사 동맹이라고 하지만 뭐 평등하다, 자유를 보장한다라고 얘기하지만 사실상 그 권한은 미국에게 있으며 그 미군에 의해서 언제든지 이 땅은 전쟁터로 전락할 수 있는 이 현실에 있는 거죠. 그래서 사실은 식민지라고 봐도 사실 무방한 현실인 거예요. 말 그대로 식민지 사회인 거예요.
The relationship between South Korea and the United States is advertised as an alliance or friendship. However, the reality paints a picture of master and slave rather than equal partners. The South Korean president does not have wartime operational control over the South Korean military. In the event of a war, South Korean soldiers would follow the orders of an American general. And not only are American soldiers occupying South Korea, US soldiers can commit crimes against Koreans on Korean soil and walk away unpunished. The Status of Forces Agreement, or SOFA, was enacted by South Korea and the United States in 1967. Under SOFA, any crimes committed by a US soldier on South Korean soil is handled under US jurisdiction, given that the soldier in question was performing official duty. The most heinous example of this occurred in 2002 when 2 US soldiers operating a military vehicle ran over and killed 2 middle school students, Hyosun and Misun, while they were walking to a birthday party. The 2 US soldiers who killed the teenage girls were investigated under US jurisdiction and were cleared of any wrongdoing.
미국인들이 자기 나라 안에서는 민주주의를 하면서 한국에서는 왜 민주주의 안 하냐 이 말이에요. 한국 사람을 개다로 된단 말이에요. 죽이려면 마음대로 죽이고 그래도 자기들은 벌 안 받고 끌려가지도 않고 잡혀가지고 조사도 안 받으려고 그러고.
Although SOFA technically does grant South Korea some level of jurisdiction over the crimes of US soldiers, most crimes go unpunished. According to South Korea's own Ministry of Justice in 2017, 7 out of 10 criminal offenses committed by US soldiers end up with no charges by South Korean authorities. And the rate for violent crimes is even higher, with 8 out of 10 crimes committed by US soldiers going unpunished. From the first invasion of US troops into Korea in 1945 to current day, US troops have treated Koreans as second-class and colonial subjects. During the Japanese occupation, hundreds of thousands of Korean women were kidnapped and enslaved to serve as sex slaves for Japanese soldiers. However, even after the US replaced Japan, this practice continued. From 1945 to the 1980s, almost 1 million South Korean women were lured or otherwise forced to serve as prostitutes for US soldiers. If the relationship between South Korea and the United States was in fact an alliance or friendship, would the US tolerate South Korean troops being stationed all across the US and behaving in the same ways US troops have behaved in Korea? Would the US government offer up American women for the pleasure of South Korean soldiers? Would the US tolerate South Korean soldiers murdering American citizens? And would the US ever give up control of its soldiers to South Korea? The most reasonable and obvious explanation of the relationship between South Korea and the United States is a colonial one. South Korea serves the US as a major strategic foothold in Asia, while Koreans pay the price in blood and sovereignty. However, the struggle to free Korea from US imperialism lives on. Koreans have not given up on their freedom and continue to fight to this day. Despite living under the constant threat of the national security law, Koreans in the occupied South have relentlessly fought the US occupation and continue to fight. From Jeju Island to Seoul, Koreans have fought and will continue to fight until the US empire leaves Korea.